Okay, I think we'll start. Thanks everyone. My name is Mathieu Dupuis. I'm a professor at Université Laval in Quebec City, and I will be your host today for this wonderful event organized by CRIMT, the auto industry in an age of tariff disruption. What about the workers? So, for 3 decades, the North American auto industry has been at the forefront of the globalization movement and the deployment of international value chain, structuring highly interdependent transcontinental production network between Canada, the US, and Mexico. Since January 2025, with the inauguration of the second Trump's administration, and particularly with the recent implementation of tariff auto production, the internationalizing trajectory might have come to an end. Well, there's a fair amount right now of coverage on the potential consequences on major auto companies and on the multiple suppliers in the value chain. This CRIMP webinar focuses on the experience and fate of auto workers and their union is this new highly disruptive context. What will be at stake today? It's three main questions that I will ask our wonderful panel to discuss. First, we'll have a presentation by Jim Stanford, who will do a presentation of the overall context of the industry. Then we'll have a part on the employment and worker livelihoods. Then a second part about green transition, the EV shift, and a third part on strategic responses from unions and auto workers. I will say that there's some interpretation for French speaker. You can click on a globe in your Zoom application, interpretation, and you will have the interpretation. Also, I would like to tell everyone that there's a recording of this webinar, and it will be diffused on numerous platforms. So if you do some comments, remember that it will be recorded. And after the three parts, we'll have a Q&A section for about 20 minutes. So I will now present our panelists. First, Jim Stanford is an economist and director of the Center for Future Work and Labor Economics think tank based in Vancouver, BC. Jim served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Unifor. He is also professor in economics at McMaster University and honorary professor at the University of Sydney. Representing Mexico, Professor Jorge Carrillo is an emeritus professor at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana, Mexico. He is recognized for his study on maquiladora and automotive industry. He is also a member of JERPISA and the CRIMT. Charlotte Yates for Canada. Dr. Charlotte Yates has studied auto workers and the auto industry for over 30 years. She published a lot, including a book in 93 on the history of the UAW in Canada. And she also been involved in the Canadian Automotive Policy Research Center, where she is currently president. Ian Greer, representing the United States, is a professor at Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations and has been studying the auto industry for 2 decades. He has looked at union strategy in North America and Europe concerning insourcing, outsourcing, offshoring, electrification. He is the author of numerous books and peer-review articles, and he's currently working on a project with several people on this call about the EV transition. And finally, Angelo Di Caro will comment in each part of this webinar. Is the director of research at Uniform and has been staff at the union for 19 years. Angelo oversees the union economic and industrial policy work and is lead analyst and policy advisor for Unifor's auto sector. And he has been involved since 28 as Unifor in the contract negotiation, and he was a labor economist lead both in the past 2 rounds of negotiation. So that's the presentation of our panelists. Then we will jump for 10 minutes by Jim Stanford, who will present the overall economic context to put the table for the discussion in this webinar. So Jim, it's your time.
Matthew, thank you very much. Matthew and Gregor, the whole amazing team at CRIMT for, first of all, identifying the need for this conversation and then making it happen. So I'm very grateful for that. I will share a few slides as we set the table, as Matthew says. Just I'll sort of set some of the broader economic context for what we're facing, debunk some of Trump's arguments, and then talk about what's going to happen next. I will refer folks who are interested to our website at the Center for Future Work. All of our work is open access there. And we have a couple of things of particular relevance here. One is a report we did debunking Trump's claims about the nature of trade deficits and what they mean. And then the other is a video that might be useful for educational purposes and so on. I will quickly, in these 10 minutes, review some of the evidence about the U.S. trade deficit, some of the reasons for the U.S. trade deficit, summarize some of the things that Trump has done in the auto trade area, although it is a moving target. Let's see, it is just after noon now, so we may have to change the presentation by the time we're finished. And then finally, a few thoughts on building a response. This will mostly be from a Canadian perspective, of course, but I think many of the points are going to be relevant from a Mexican end as well. First of all, this idea that the trade deficit is an emergency in America and somehow constitutes the rest of the world taking advantage of America is just nonsense. The U.S. has had a trade deficit with the rest of the world for 49 straight years. Safe bet, it'll be 50 this year. And it isn't because the rest of the world takes advantage of America. It isn't because America subsidizes the rest of the world. This is a structural feature of the U.S. economy, and we'll talk about why. It isn't even big compared to previous years. So Trump's invocation of the trade deficit as justification for what he's doing is pure political ideology and nothing else. There's no economic basis for his claim that this is new, that it's an emergency, or that it's damaging America. In fact, the trade deficit at around 3% of U.S. GDP is relatively small by the standards of recent history. Certainly can't blame Canada for the trade deficit. In 2023, the most recent full-year data, Canada ranked 10th among U.S. trading partners in the size of the trade deficit. And relative to the huge two-way flow, Canada and the U.S. have $1 trillion two-way flow in goods and services trade. It's relatively balanced. That $40 billion U.S. Trade deficit that America has with Canada across all goods and services. It's not 100 billion. It's not 200 billion. It's not 300 billion. Trump changes the numbers every time he gets on TV, almost like a game show. You know, the price is right. 100 billion. Who bids 200 billion? Who says 300 billion? It was actually 40 billion in 2023, smaller in 2024. And that was a very small share of the huge two-way bilateral flow of $1 trillion. For every dollar of goods and services Canada sells in the U.S., it's 92 cents that they sell back in Canada, relatively balanced. Trump has said he doesn't need anything from Canada. He doesn't need our cars. He doesn't need our oil. He doesn't need our forestry products. That's all lies, of course. We all know about the oil, 4.5 million barrels a day flowing to the U.S., and this is a long-term legacy of Canada's integration into the U.S. energy system. That was a major goal of the original free trade agreement between Canada and the U.S. in 1989. Canada accounts for over half of all U.S. Oil imports, but it's also true of just about everything else that we sell in America. 75% of Canada's exports to the U.S. are intermediate products that are used by U.S. businesses to produce their own goods and services for sale to Americans and to export markets. Only about 25% are finished products, including passenger vehicles. So Trump is shooting America in both feet, not just one foot, both feet. Number one, he's making it more expensive for American companies to produce their stuff for any markets, domestic or foreign. Number two, he's going to cripple the important trading partners of the U.S., including Canada, Mexico, and other countries where the U.S. has to sell their goods. So there's no economic logic whatsoever to what Trump is claiming. Trump never talks about trade in services. This is important to think about how we push back against Trump. That's because America has a lock on international trade in services, which is the fastest growing part of international trade. They have a very large trade surplus in services with Canada, the largest genuine trade surplus in services. Ireland ranks higher, but that's a tax loophole that U.S. companies use Ireland as a form of tax evasion because of the low corporate tax rate there. They've all established big subsidiaries in Ireland, which then they relocate through internal transfer pricing the profits of their operations to Ireland to take advantage of that, and then they pay it back by the Irish subsidiary, paying the parent firm back in the US huge amounts for intellectual property or management fees or other things like that. So that shows up as a trade surplus, but it's phony. It's all about tax evasion. With Canada, it's a genuine trade surplus, and it reflects the dominant role of US companies in the services sector, whether it's finance, business services, digital services, streaming services, all the things that we buy from American giants whose CEOs were in the front row at Trump's inauguration show up in this bar. And this is something for us all to think about in terms of how we push back at America. What are the reasons for that trade deficit? Many factors can cause a trade deficit in the economy. Macroeconomic differences, trade policies can certainly play a role, or a lack of competitiveness for a while. You can't run a trade deficit forever, even if you're uncompetitive. That's the rationale for the whole theory of balance of payments constrained growth, which is a key finding of heterodox international trade theory. But if you're going to run one for 49 straight years, something else is happening, and that is called capital flows. And because the US is still, for all its flaws, the center of world capitalism, trillions of dollars of capital flow into the US year after year after year, from individual rich people, from investment firms, from hedge funds, from banks, from central banks, from governments, all buying US dollar denominated assets for various reasons, a hedge against risk, or they just want a piece of the action in the center of global capitalism. And those constant capital inflows facilitate a trade deficit. They've got more money than they would have had if they had to earn it, okay? In other words, they're consuming more than they produce, they're buying more than they sell, and it's them who has their hands out to the rest of the world to say, give me money so I can keep buying from you. That is not a subsidy to the rest of the world. If anything, that's a subsidy from the rest of the world to the US. And the greatest irony, if Trump's strategy, if you can call it that, is indeed to encourage real businesses to relocate capital to the United States, guess what? That's a capital inflow, and it's going to make the trade deficit worse. It's a matter of national income accounting that the trade deficit has a mirror image in a net capital inflow. So again, it's just utterly contradictory what he's trying to do. If we wanted to talk about who's subsidizing whom, and that was the title of the paper that I mentioned at the beginning, there's various ways that the US has a sweet deal in its relationship with some of its major trading partners. In Canada's case, we identified 3. We sell those 4.5 million barrels of oil a day to the US at well below world price. Secondly, we don't count, we don't regulate, and we don't tax most of those services exports from the US to Canada. Third, we, like the rest of the world, supply the US with huge amounts of capital to allow them to run this trade deficit year after year. Yet we pay interest to the US on a net basis. This is a very strange finding. The net flow of investment income, interest, profits, and dividends goes from Canada to the US, even though Canada is now a huge net creditor on the capital account with the US. We could find similar ways that Mexico subsidizes America and the rest of the world as well. This is not the US being hard done by. This just shows you the explosion of Canadian holdings of US debt. I was surprised when I looked at these numbers because I grew up in the 70s when we were concerned about US capital dominance of Canada. But in the last decade, it's all switched. And now Canada owns much more of the US than the other way around, about $1.5 trillion net capital surplus, including $600 billion of straight up US debt. And that cumulative increase in Canadian holdings of US debt is actually the offset of the cumulative trade deficit, which the US has run with Canada over that period. So again, we are giving them the money to keep running this deficit, and yet we're paying them interest on it. That's amazing. Try that with your bank. Try that with your bank. Go to your bank, get a mortgage, and say, you're going to pay me interest, not the other way around. Just to quickly summarize what Trump has done in the auto policy area, and the other speakers, especially Angelo, will have much more detail on this. The supposed goal is to relocate auto production to the United States. I never say back to the United States. We have to eliminate that word. We have to expunge that word back from our vocabulary in this discussion because these jobs were not in the US to start with. They just want to grab more of the work from wherever it can be grabbed, but it's not feasible economically and industrially. They don't have the capital, they don't have the facilities, they don't have the skilled labor to do this work. So this is the supposed goal, but I don't think they even believe it's realistic. Certainly the auto industry leaders don't think it's realistic. We've seen a whole slew of tariffs imposed for different reasons in different ways at different times. Canada and Mexico were exempted from the so-called reciprocal tariffs. That was this joke that applied tariffs to the uninhabited islands in Antarctica and other countries of the world. But we got hit with everything else, including the so-called fentanyl tariffs, which were the first gun fired. Trump has repeatedly delayed several components of the plan. Yesterday, he announced that the stacking of tariffs, where you could have paid the 25% on everything for fentanyl, for steel and aluminum, on the finished product and on the parts. He's tried to clarify the stacking won't happen, but we're still getting hammered with huge tariffs. And this 2-year temporary remission program that he announced, enormous confusion and uncertainty around the world, including in the auto industry. Nobody is going to make an investment of real money in real capital until they sort out what the world looks like. So this confusion and erratic behavior is going to undermine the so-called effectiveness of his policies, and it's also going to cause a recession. You're seeing a cautious willingness by industry leaders to speak out against this with that joint letter that they sent. But executives are still cowed by Trump's authoritarian power and his willingness to wield it. We saw that yesterday again with Jeff Bezos backing off of his plan to break out the cost of the tariff on receipts at Amazon. If Jeff Bezos is intimidated by Trump, everyone else is definitely going to be intimidated by Trump. Ironically, through all of this, I know we'll talk about this, the UAW supporting Trump and these tariffs, which is hard to understand, but at any rate isn't going to be decisive. If they think that the UAW's support for this is somehow going to win the day or affect the outcome, I think that's far-fetched. What comes next, last of all, I think we're going to be led by economic and financial events more than political events, perhaps. We're seeing growing signs of weakness in the US economy as well as globally because of the incredible uncertainty for both investors and consumers about what's happening. Likely to see a continent-wide recession, not just in Canada and Mexico, but in the US as well. It will probably start in the US. You will see higher prices for automotive products in the US. That will reduce sales. You'll also see disruptions and job losses for other reasons. Companies that don't know what they're dealing with are pausing production. We've seen some of that in all three countries. Capital investment is not going to happen until companies know what the lay of the land is. Parts suppliers could be the weak link. There are parts suppliers that will just go under because of the extra costs, and that will just have unpredictable disruptions in supply chains. And you're going to have a recession. By the way, automotive sales are a highly pro-cyclical industry. They always suffer disproportionately during a recession. So we're going to see thousands of job losses, hundreds of thousands of job losses in the auto industry, and the biggest number of those job losses will be in the US. Proportionately, Canada and Mexico probably get hit worse, but the biggest absolute cost will be in the US. In the broader context, of course, Trump has bigger problems. The back down with China, the confusion of all of his decisions on all industries is going to be a problem. It could be that we see a shift in the politics. We're seeing Trump back down on things, but trying to do it in a face-saving way because of the enormous opposition at home to what he's doing. Canada has responded with some measures in the auto sector and elsewhere, not a mirror image, not tit for tat, but just trying to make sure we have some leverage at the bargaining table if and when we get there. And from Carney's call with Trump yesterday, it sounds like we will get there. The auto policy measures are going to be important, and we've seen the government take some measures, not enough yet, but some of them that will be important. I think that we're going to have to think bigger, though, and I'm keen to hear from Angelo and the others about how. Because CUSMA is effectively dead, the World Trade Organization is effectively dead. The previous restrictions on our policy that prevented us from doing a kind of value-added, content-based industrial strategy that overruled the Auto Pact in 2001, watered down the Auto Pact in the first place in the original NAFTA. All of those, I think, create an opening to think bigger about the basic principle of the Auto Pact, which was if you're going to sell here, you have to produce here. It doesn't have to be the same stuff that you produced here, but you have to produce an equivalent amount. And I think that principle is going to loom very large as we think through what comes next. Trump's going to face increasing pressures at home, and that could settle the day in the end. But Canada can't wait, and I suspect Mexico can't wait either. We will have to continue to deal with the U.S. Canada is the mouse next to the elephant, and Mexico is the country that was too far from heaven and too close to America. Those are our respective national adages. And we'll have to both learn to deal with America as much as we can. But at the same time, I think this is going to be a big kick in the pants to both countries, that we have to have a more self-reliant, self-directed industrial and economic development strategy. And that is what we used to call a national policy. In Canada, import substitution, industrialization in Mexico. Who knows? What goes around comes around. So I'll leave it at that, Matthew. Look forward to the discussion, and thank you very much again to CRIMT for organizing this.
Thanks a lot, Jim. I just want to say to the participant that they can also put question in the chat while we're discussing. So feel free to start the discussion. So after Jim's presentation, I will jump to the first part of our discussion, what will be around employment and worker livelihoods. So I will ask each panelist, and then Angelo will comment. Do you expect in your respective country massive layoff, plant shutdown in the short run, core assembly, and in the value chain? And what are the potential consequences on the working condition of the auto workers and on the communities in which they belong? So I will start with Charlotte for Canada. So maybe you could tell us your thought about this in 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mathieu. So I want to say thanks again, echo Jim's thanks to CRIMT for doing this. I think these discussions are incredibly important. These are issues that are not just important to us as researchers, they're important to us as citizens, as supporters of workers. So I want to say thanks, but also Jim, thanks for that context. It was a really great context setting. I just want to add a couple of things, if I can, which feed into my answer to the question about layoffs. I think, Jim, you're quite right. New capital is not going to be invested in Canada until there is a greater sense of what is that future and what's the stability. I think that has long-term implications for Canada potentially, although I don't think automakers will pull out their capital now because tariffs come and go. Investments in auto are 30 to 50 years. So in that sense, they're not going to abandon it, could look smaller, and that has implications for employment. But I think it's the volatility that will be damaging not just to the industry, but to individual industry players. And that brings me to a couple of caveats, I think, that are particular to Canada. One is, well, globally, I think the position of Stellantis. Stellantis employs 9,000 workers in Canada. They've already closed down the Windsor plant, reopened it with uncertainty in the future. I think Stellantis as a company could be in real trouble. I think we could be seeing, like we did with Chrysler in 1979 and again in 1990, where they need significant government support in order to survive. Stellantis was already in financial trouble before we had Trump. So in that sense, I think we need to look carefully at that. We need to look at what does that mean for worker transitions, because Stellantis did such a big investment in EV. So I think governments need to have specific plans to support companies, or to think if Stellantis does go under, what does that mean? Do we invest, or do we try and attract a different automaker to Canada? So I think these are big industry-wide Canada questions. I think also GM Oshawa could be in trouble. It was already closed down once. I think GM is already signaling it's trying to consolidate as much of its production in the US as possible. So I think these are long-term these are decisions which could have long-term implications for Canada's automotive industry. So all in all, I think, like Jim said, I do expect both immediate but also long-term layoffs and fairly significant layoffs. I think this means obviously declining income for workers, their families, and their communities. And this has both long and short-term effects. So I think, first of all, this has massive ripples throughout the labor market, but particularly in Ontario, and in particular communities that are very auto-dependent. We know that for the automotive industry, there is about 7 jobs created for every 1 in the automotive industry. If you think about that, yes, it can be auto parts, it can be services, but it can also be all the services that workers buy in their communities. All of those jobs are dependent on the auto industry. So it's like a set of bowling pins that once the auto worker gets laid off, then there's a series of other layoffs that happens. There's a series of other deteriorations of working conditions and income conditions for workers. I think we have to pay attention to the age of workers. I think young workers will pay a particular price for this. In GM Oshawa, after it closed last time and they paid off all the older workers, then they hired a ton of new workers, younger workers. We need to think what happens for those workers who have their houses, they're newly married, they have young children. Those kind of things, again, government policy needs to think about what the effect that has. In terms of other effects on workers of this declining income and deteriorating community is a significant impact on health and stress. A series of studies of industry, auto industry at various times of crisis have shown that families face increased marital problems, increased mental health issues, increased problems for children at school. And I think that kind of uncertainty, income loss is something we need to get ahead of. We need to anticipate that, put into place the appropriate supports, but also make sure that we are kind of protecting those communities and allowing them to remain vibrant as much as possible. I do worry about the impact on communities as a whole, and we have several communities that are very, very auto-dependent. So I don't want to be depressing, but I think we are going to see thousands of people impacted by this, and we need to then see what kind of supports can be had and what's the both short-term and long-term. I don't want to end on a depressing note. Fortunately, you have a couple of questions which will allow us to be a little bit more optimistic going forward.
Thanks, Charlotte. I will turn now to Jorge.
Hi, well, thank you again for this invitation. And I totally agree with Charlotte. Volatility is a critical issue, and also the short time to have a clarity on what is going on in the medium-term impacts. Anyway, for Mexico, the auto industry is quite important. It's more than 1.2, 1.3 million employees, plus it depends how you count it, but it's 3 to 2 times the spillovers. So it's a huge impact what is going on right now. In a more general context, it's important to mention that the main generators of foreign exchange in Mexico is the U.S. Manufacture exports, remittances from migrants, tourism, and well, not so important right now, the oil exports, but all this figure gives a huge dependency on the U.S. Anyway, it's important to highlight that the impacts vary. So the unit of analysis is important, because if we're talking about the impacts of the industry as a whole, the impact in some regions, but also I try to understand more what is happening in some plants, and it varies a lot. So the effects of the tariffs in the Europeans or US companies is quite different in terms of the cost of the prices increase of the vehicles, but also in terms of the US content. For instance, the Germans, Koreans is 20 to 30% the US content, while the American is 50%. But for instance, the Ford Mustang, the EV model is almost 80% Mexican content. So that makes a huge difference in terms of the impacts. So related with that, the strategies from the companies vary. Nissan is more focused on logistic and commercial, while the US and European plants are at least that's what I'm saying, they are more actively working on improved regional content in the supply chain. When we talk about specific models, it's also the important difference. We found that companies that are producing global mandates, such as Tacoma in Toyota, has more strengths, more resilience with these tariff issues, whilst others like GM in Silao and especially Stellantis in Toluca. The Toluca plant may be downsizing 80% to the minimum level. But this is maybe I hope so, an exceptional story. So in terms of general trends for the employment impacts, it's not so clear. There are some forecasts that the analysts or consultants are mentioned, but it goes from, I mean, the impacts of 20,000 lost jobs to 300,000. So it's nobody knows. That's the issue. Nobody knows. But anyway, the suppliers, the supplier segment, my feeling, my opinion is that they are more fragile in this period, in this problem of with the tariffs and the volatility as a whole. And 80% of the employment belongs to the parts in Mexico. Only 12 is in the OEMs, and generally speaking, is 30% less the wages, and especially when we're talking about women, which is more than 50% in that sector. Well, we measure is the wages are less. So as Charlotte mentioned, new investment and new projects are just frozen. Not just the Americans, but the new ones, even the Chinese. So my general opinion is not quite depressive so far. Massive layoffs or widespread plant closures, particularly among OEMs and Tier 1 suppliers, I think are unlikely for 2025. Okay, if the tariff goes on and because it's changing on a daily basis, if it still continue in 2026, that will be a very, very different scenario. On the one hand, second, an important aspect is a debate in terms of and this is for the next question, but the Mexican footprint is based on the IC models, the gasoline vehicles. So in that sense, it keeps or remaining some safely while the consumers and the market demand this type of cars. Talking about the last issue, the new projects for investment, I mean, general information from the analyst said that it takes from 1.5 to 7 years to take the reshoring. So it's a long time process, and it's a very, very, as everybody knows that people that do company research, that is a huge and complex decision. So tariff is important, but it's one element, not the whole. So the government strategy and the debate, as is mentioned by Charlotte and by the first speaker, the Mexican consumption and production is more focused on industrial policies and more national policies in order uh, uh, to make some equilibrium with the huge dependency with US. Anyway, the damage is done in terms of the prices, the investments, the new projects, and the questionable commercial treaty. So it's a huge debate right now in terms of the Mexican industrialization strategy based on export platform is now under a huge debate. I will finish with that.
Thanks, Jorge. And we'll jump down now to Ian. Representing the US or trying to speak for the US?
Well, it is an honor to be the sole representative of my country in this forum. And it's hard to focus on the narrow question which has been put before me, which is whether these tariffs will lead to plant closures and layoffs. And the short answer is yes. So despite that, many American labor movement people support it. You know, they support it because we have lived our political lives sticking up and defending working class communities from the ravages of the market, and that includes the global marketplace for manufactured goods. The US has pushed a liberal economic order, and we've had events like the Battle of Seattle, where our conviction that this is unjust and wrong has really been cemented, I think, in our collective consciousness as a labor movement. And in addition to that, we also have seen communities really damaged by companies that closed down production and started producing the same thing in other countries, much more cheaply, using workers with lower wages. That is widely considered devastating and unfair. And we certainly have plenty of examples of that in New York State. The biggest one was American Axle, which made many thousands of New Yorkers unemployed, opened plants in Mexico, and the CEO wrote a book proclaiming Mexico as sort of manufacturing heaven. So please have a little bit of understanding for our point of view on this. On the other hand, it's going to lead to layoffs and plant closures, right? So when I saw that the UAW just basically supported this without much or any criticism, my first thought was, well, what about those plants that are supplying Canada and Mexico and are going to experience immediate layoffs because of that? So that's one source of it. Of course, the union can just blame management and say management is playing games and doesn't have to do that. But, those layoffs are real. The damage to people's lives is being done. In the long run, though, I think there's a much more important problem, which is this promised phase of after the pain, work being more work, work being brought back. This is a false promise, or maybe an exaggerated promise. The problem is, as we heard, it's very slow, and it's slowed by the tariffs. So the union needs investment. Investment is slowed by uncertainty, and for reasons we heard from the other speakers, these tariffs are done in a way which creates way more uncertainty than a restrictive trade policy necessarily needs to do. I mean, so the process is slow because of the bureaucratic process of planning in these corporations. It's slow for technical reasons because it takes a very long time to build a plant, to introduce the machinery, and to get the machinery to function productively. There's also market uncertainty. We don't know, you never know if the new vehicles that are being produced, if they're going to succeed on the market. So all of this means that it's slow. And then it's because it's slowed down, retooling periods can be extended, as Canada has seen, but is also going to happen in the United States. And then maybe even more importantly, for plants that are still producing cars, product cycles have to be extended, or plans have to be delayed. So that means that plants that are making things now are going to get new investment delayed. This is going to lead in a few years as their products sort of expire and become obsolete, for those plants to eliminate shifts and eventually really have to struggle to get work. So on the other questions, we can talk about those later, but that's my take on layoffs and plant closures.
Thanks, Ian. Then if Angelo wants to comment on the observation by our three panelists, so in 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's like you just pointed me at the buffet and you said you can only eat this little thing over here, right? There's a lot to digest, lot to take on.
Chicken away.
Yeah, I'll do my best. This is great, and again, like echoing what everyone else said, I just appreciate you folks inviting me and even for running this, and thank you, Jim, as always, for a great setup piece. Wonderful. So I'll pick up on some of the things that that each of the speakers raised. I want to start with what Jorge said about the broader comment around vulnerability. There's a desperate desire from reporters and the public to just have a blanket assessment about what this means for the industry. And I think most folks on this call who study the auto sector and know that it's not really how the analysis has to work. In a lot of ways, you have to look at plants specifically about what their exposure is and what they build and what they do. And you also have to distinguish between assembly plants and supply plants, because they also live in two very different universes when it comes to the impacts of these things. There's three things I would say that you have to look for when you're doing that Jorge's vulnerability assessment by plant. And it's the question of twinning production, meaning what do you already build in other plants? The transition that is taking place on EVs and plants being down. And then this bigger question for Canada and Mexico, I think, which is trucks. So the three T's. The issue is as Ian and Jorge both said, it is very costly and very timely and very difficult to just bulldoze a factory and rebuild a new one somewhere else. That is a complicated endeavor and likely not to happen anytime soon. What's much easier is the idea that you've got platforms that are twinned. They are the same platforms, and you can dial down job rates in one plant and you can dial up job rates in another plant. Canada is heavily exposed to this right now, particularly as Charlotte said, in Oshawa. We build trucks that are built in Mexico. Mexico builds trucks that are also built in Fort Wayne and Flint. So this is not good, and that becomes a bit of a challenge. I guess in terms of the actual effect on the second T, the transition, what creates this vulnerability is the fact that a lot of plants, on the promise of where we are moving toward, building new products for a burgeoning market in electric vehicles, those plants, like in Canada, places like Oakville, places like Brampton, Stellantis, places like GM Powertrain in St. Catharines. We have workers on layoff because they are waiting for machinery to be installed so they can start building new EVs and EV component parts. That also is being upended, and in the midst of those workers being out of work, on layoff, and waiting to restart, that opens this new vulnerability about relocating work in this period. And I believe it would be the same situation affecting our friends in Mexico. And then I say the third T is trucks, because up until last week, everything that has happened so far on auto tariffs have been focused mostly on light duty vehicles. and light duty trucks. And there seemed to be this sense of like, well, what happened to the heavy duty trucks? Where did they go? Why are they not being tariffed? Well, no, they're going to be because last week there was a new investigation announced into these trucks. Everything going from 5-ton heavy duty pickup trucks that you use on farms and things like that, all the way up to big dump trucks, 16-ton massive trucks, 18-wheelers. That is going to be the subject of a new investigation. And frankly, that was one of the hopes we were holding off for Oakville and Oshawa, because they were going to build heavy-duty trucks, and now that's a new calculation that has to be made. I'll close on just from that pickup from what Charlotte said around sort of the structural decline, the vulnerability on workers. And one thing I think we can't lose sight of is the fact that in the midst of this transition, a very hopeful transition, frankly, for the Canadian auto industry at least, as I say, workers have been on layoff. And so it's not like they're sitting there working overtime and then they're waiting to see what happens with production declines. They are not working, and they've burned through their EI, and they are burning through supports we've bargained. Now, what you're proposing to them is extended layoff periods. This is like a hidden tragedy in this whole thing, because not only will income supports possibly not be there for thousands and thousands and thousands of workers in assembly plants and down the supply chain, but to Charlotte's point is what is happening with the next generation of auto workers? The biggest threat last year was, are you going to keep young workers, skilled workers in the auto sector, so that when the EVs are rolled out, we've got the same skilled workers building great new EVs for the market. Now you're proposing to these young workers, hey, we don't know when you're going to come back. If you're going to come back, there is going to be a mass exodus of this skill from the sector, which if and when we do come back and are back and rolling, this is going to look quite a bit different. And then just to close on Ian's final point, I think it's very poignant about what are we coming back to? The worst case scenario here is all of what's been happening and the effect on workers is this is creating a structural realignment of the auto industry. Forecasters are already predicting that the forecasted vehicle sales for the year are going to be far less than they were. There's going to be cost implications for the cars, about consumer demand for these cars. And if we see that, what the industry refers to it as the SAR threshold, seasonally adjusted annual rate of sales, if that goes down, that's going to have a direct effect on production forecasts and volumes. That means workers are going to get laid off because of that. And then further to that, sort of on the same end of this threat on tariffs, even if there were no tariffs, Trump's policy around upending EV adoption, charging infrastructures, incentives for EVs, if his goal was to just turn that whole dial down, that also presents a structural long-term threat for the industry, because if we don't start building first generation mass-produced EVs that are high quality, if all this ends up coming to an end, we're going to learn real quick how far ahead the Chinese automakers are in doing this stuff. And not so many tariffs are going to hold them at the gates any longer. So there's a strategic vulnerability for workers that we have to consider. So anyways, I really appreciated those comments, and I hope I've added some useful supplement, but looking forward to the next question.
Yeah, it's a great supplement. Thanks, Angelo. And it's a really good introduction for our second part. Before the start of tariff war, the North American auto industry was on the pace of transitioning its production to battery and hybrid electrical vehicle. First, do you think the tariff will be a retreat from this transition? And what does it mean to workers in the auto industry who were expected to transition from ICV to BHEV? So it's really good introduction, because Angela has already pointed out this issue of the skilled workers and the future that they can have in this industry. So I will start with Ian.
Thanks, Matthew. Tariffs are going to slow down the EV transition. US tariffs already have slowed down the EV transition in the US because under Biden, who introduced 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. This slows down the EV transition because Chinese producers are offering something which you really need in order to have a rapid switch to electrification of cars, which is EVs that are affordable to most people. So the product strategies of the Detroit 3 and the startups are, for the most part, luxury vehicles or larger vehicles. They're expensive and profitable, and that's good for workers because there's a bigger pie to distribute in bargaining. But it is bad for the EV transition because we need cars that people can afford. And so that is a big problem. And in the past, the UAW was talked a lot about making vehicles that its members can afford. And this way of thinking about distribution and consumption is really upended by the strategy of the companies and the strategy of the union for making gains in bargaining. So it's a tough, I mean, it's not the solution to that is not obvious, but tariffs do slow down the adoption of EVs in the United States because of cost. There's a second thing though that is also really important for slowing down the process, and this gets back to the problem of uncertainty and investment. So we need investments, and if it's going to be a just transition, they need to be investments in places with good jobs that already exist. And the problem with the tariffs is that the incumbent automakers that are unionized have these big sprawling production systems that go across international borders and therefore are particularly susceptible to barriers to trade such as tariffs. Their whole strategy has been built on a transnational production strategy that is upended by tariffs. That is less the case with the EV startups, which have a smaller productive footprint and are much more concentrated in the United States. So what this is going to do is this is not just going to, I think it's intended to buy time for incumbent producers to figure out the EV transition, figure out how to supply the domestic market. But the beneficiaries really are the startups, Tesla, Rivian, Lucid maybe. And these are non-union. These are not good employers, especially Tesla is a horrible employer. They abuse subsidies, they abuse workers, they commit labor law violations, they're subject to civil rights investigations, they're toxic workplaces. And that is really what benefits more from this approach to tariffs, way more than companies that arguably provide good jobs. So with that, I would like to pass it back to you, Mathieu, for the next speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Charlotte?
Thanks, Mathieu. Very, very interesting. And so I don't want to double down so much on tariffs because I think Ian did a good job of kind of two of the factors that drive changes to the EV market. But one of the ones that we haven't looked at is significant worldwide are incentives for consumers to buy vehicles. The fact that those incentives have been eliminated in the US, but they've been eliminated as well in many countries around the world and in Canada, this has really reduced the demand for vehicle. And the reason they're needed is, as Ian suggested, those EVs that are being produced right now tend to be very high cost as a whole. And so those incentives and those are incentives for consumers. It makes those vehicles more affordable. So I think that there's two things going on here that's impacting the EV industry. Yes, it's tariffs and those trade factors, but it's also the incentives for consumers. So I think And that the reason why that's important is it's important about what we think government should do, and our government, our new national government, should do going forward in order to continue the momentum behind the EV. So I think that's important that we need that. I think, what does this mean for, I'm going to tackle, you've had two questions. Sort of what are the economic effects on the transition to EV? But then the second is, what does this mean for workers who have been retrained? So I want to double down a little bit on the fact that Canada has to continue. And I think, Angela, you said this is about a strategic investment in the future for Canada. EV production is not just about producing another car or another version of a truck. This is about the sustainability of the industry long term. There is going to be long-term demand for EVs, battery hybrid, but also, I suspect, highly efficient ICEs. And this is something which, an alternative fuel ICEs, where I think Canada could also play a really big role, because we have expertise, not just in production, but in terms of our innovative capacities around those ICEs. Canada is a real expert in internal combustion engines. Can we recruit firms here that also double down on that? So I think if we're thinking about a sustainability plan for the automotive industry, we need to look across all of those. I think Canada has some comparative advantages for building a supply chain around EVs, and our governments have certainly tried to use those as a basis to recruit investment. And that's the fact that we've got the minerals, we've got the expertise, we've got cheap and green hydropower in very many provinces, particularly Quebec, but also Ontario. So in that sense, we have many of the ingredients to make a robust EV supply chain. And again, for that reason, this is a good Canadian solution, or a good future for the Canadian automotive industry, is to look at that sustainable industry. The final piece I would say, though, is to think about it not just as auto. The kind of innovations, the kind of production can actually, Angela, you touched on this when you talked about large trucks, buses, trains. Canada can have a space that is nationwide around electric mobility. And that would put us in, I think, a competitive position in a number of industries going forward for a sustainable future. I think also this means then that we need to think about, do we need an additional automaker or other auto parts being recruited to Canada? I think about Volkswagen's investment, and I think it's PowerCo in Tilsonburg. Those kind of investments are key for Canada to have a place in the EV industry. Very briefly on the training of workers. There's lots of evidence to suggest, first of all, we have one of the most highly trained automotive workforces in the world. It's one of the best workforces in the world. So in that sense, I think the training they've been given to make the transition to EVs, those are a study by APRC with CSTEC on the skills shows a lot of those skills are transferable to other industries. The big risk for the auto industry is that industries like the nuclear industry and others will recruit those workers, and then the auto industry, when it reboots, will actually struggle, as it has done in the very recent past, to find the workers who will work in the auto industry, because they will have moved on to other industries, because those skills are transferable. So I think we need to think seriously about how we sustain that. So that means governments need to commit to consumer incentives for EVs. They need to have a very targeted investment industrial strategy around electric mobility. And that means very much focus on the auto industry, but also the full supply chain. And again, they need the kind of income supports that will both protect workers from the tariffs, but also as we move forward to that EV transition, which is the long-term strategic hope, I think, for the Canadian industry.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte. Jorge?
Yes. Well, in general terms, the transition, but not just the electrification, but the connectivity, both, is my general opinion and my general view is this is going on and it won't stop. Massive investment and huge number of technological alliance between any company, any technological and any automaker, the incumbent or the new ones are working hard on that. So and especially the role of China is quite important. So I think that the transition is going on. What's happening in Mexico? Well, first, the EV sales in Mexico is in a rapid growth, but still very limited. It goes from 3% to 8% of the total national sales between 2020 2024, which is less than the worldwide, which is 20%. Few companies and plants are producing EVs, such as Ford and GM. And some of them will announce that they are follow and expand the EV production, such as the GM Ramos Arizpe. Chinese imports, brands, and sales are increasing a lot. More or less is 50,000, which is only 4% of the total sales. So what I'm saying is, it's a rapid growth, but still very limited in Mexico. But the forecast is this will grow more and more. In terms of production, as I mentioned before, the IC footprint in Mexico still, I mean, will remain. So very few EV production will take place in Mexico. This is the forecast. Anyway, with this problem of the tariffs, will intensify this delay of electrification. But the opportunity that is taking the companies and supported also by some unions is to focus on the hybrid models, because hybrid models are well taken in the UMSCA region, not just in the US, but in Mexico as well, and in Canada, I guess. So is relatively so easy to change from the IC to hybrid, which happened already. So that brings me the issue of the importance, as I mentioned before, of the national industrial policies, because trade deficit, as the first speaker mentioned, is not the issue. I mean, a strong one to highlight. The issue is who generate the value and who capture the value, and Mexico is not. Is not. So the importance of industrial policy, such as the Mexican program that announced by the Mexican president, is a quite important. I mean, if really put some resources on that. Also, this is a EV brand, Mexican EV brand is going on right now. So, and there are other initiatives. So these initiatives will not change the equilibrium between US and Mexico, the dependency, but it's a good start. So my last point is, because as I mentioned, the transition to electrification and connectivity is going on. Well, China is, we cannot speak without bringing the China issue. And for Mexico economy, the trade with China is quite important, very important. So and my forecast, my opinion is will be higher, the trade and investment of China in Mexico, not just in the auto, but in many other sectors. So I think we need to stress, we need to have more policy, clear policy with China, and not just follow the U.S. mandate by Trump, because I understand that the Mexican president strategy is do not confront, do not escalate the problem. But anyway, China is a key player in this in the economy, but it's specific in the auto sector. So it needs to have more clear strategy, and it's not easy, but this is on debate. That's it.
Thanks, Jorge. Angelo, want to jump in for a quick comment?
Yeah, well, I'm mindful of the time, so I'll be even I'll try to be quick on this, but appreciate great interventions on this. I'll go back in turn, and I'll make a couple of points on Jorge's last point, which I think is very, very important. So to Ian's point, I love the analysis on how these tariffs will affect different types of automakers, and what those automakers who will potentially benefit more because of their smaller scale, what do they represent? And there's no question, these new EV startups like Lucid and Rivian and Tesla, not exactly the biggest friends to organized labor, as our European friends know all too well. What I just wanted to point out, which I think is an interesting development, is in the last number of years, before this Trump tariff war began, it became common practice where a lot of the Detroit 3 legacy automakers were recruiting former executives from these EV startups to run their manufacturing operations in North America. It was the case, and still is, with Stellantis, and up until recently, it was the case at General Motors. Their chief manufacturing officer just resigned. And I don't know if that's indicative of where the strategy was heading and now is pivoting, but that's a space I think worth watching, and how this plays out in labor relations would be an interesting feature as well. So I thought great points. On Charlotte's points, yes, and her and I, our kinship is Canada, so we have a lot to say just on what's going on in the country. I am a firm believer that the strategy we must employ would be to not take our eyes off the ball of a long wave transition in the sector. That would be a complete failure of vision. And for us to succeed, we have to keep our eyes on that. The extension of the auto sector beyond just light duty vehicles is very important as part of this conversation. And I guess in some ways, in early days, a new government, maybe not as robust a strategy as I've seen come out of the Claudia Sheinbaum administration, but the new Prime Minister Mark Carney, presenting ideas, putting money where his mouth is on response strategies, seeking new investments, talking about the auto footprint in a whole of industry context, I think is, at least from the words, very useful. We'll see how this advances. And then the other piece, I think, with Canada specifically, is that you can't take away our strategic advantage when it comes to building out the EV supply chain, because Trump can do whatever he wants, but the cobalt is still up in northern Quebec, and so is the lithium, and we've got all these resources. That's why investors were flocking to Canada, because they were going to tap into that. That's not changed. Maybe our positioning on what that's going to look like at the end of the day, that's what might change. So lots to do. And finally on Jorge's point, boy, like this China question, we should probably do a webinar just on China and how this intersects. As I said in my first remarks, I think you could look at this, you could take tariffs out of the equation and then just focus on Trump's effect through EV policy, consumer policy, and what that was going to do to create vulnerabilities in the industry. That alone was going to be a challenge. The tariffs is like all the fondant and the icing you just slap on top of it all, and then and we've got the situation we're in now. But the real geopolitical, like the question presented to us right now is, what happens with China moving forward? What role do they play in an increasingly isolationist U.S. Approach to industrial development? That opens up interesting, an interesting line of thought. But also, maybe not so much with Mexico, but certainly with Canada. I mean, we leaned in to U.S. policy to try and incubate the EV market. We needed plants to get up and running, to build first generation electric vehicles, to build first generation battery cell and cathode plants. Like, that's all on pause right now. But to do that, it was determined the right policy response was creating tariff walls so that China, we know they're coming, just not yet. Give us some time so we can compete. That has a domino effect on the politics of the country, and I'm telling you, if this is the new world we're living in with Trump, with the tariffs and upending EV policy, the political structure holding up or validating those tariffs, that's falling apart. You're pitting the country against each other. Canola farmers are now suffering the effects of what they see as a completely useless policy. We're holding out now Chinese EV investments and sales for what? We're now pivoting back into ICE vehicles. So this is an incoherent policy response. China's at the heart of it, and it's going to have geopolitical consequences for our country going forward. So that's another space we're going to have to pick up on. So anyways, I'll stop there, but back to you, Matthew.
Yes, thanks, Angelo. So we'll jump to the third part, and I will ask our panelists to be more concise in this part, since I want to have a couple of minutes to have some discussion with the audience. So that's the question of auto workers and their union. And we all know that they have been central actors in the sector for decades, but now they sit in a kind of uncomfortable position regarding free trade. So what do you expect as strategic responses from labor union and auto workers in your respective country? And we already know that UAW took a position. So what about Mexico, Jorge?
Okay, three aspects. First, at least for 2025, good indicator is the companies are reviewing salary increases. And for instance, Toyota has a 13%, and Volkswagen it's supposed is going to 5 or 10%, etc. So for 26, that's another story. Okay, so this is a good indicator. Because the volatility, the demand is fluctuating, and so in order to navigate with this volatility, in the past we have employment agencies now are forbidden. So overtime is a key element. It's a key element in the companies in order to navigate with this volatility in the demand. So, and as mentioned in the first space, each company has a different stories. So companies such as Toyota, they don't have problems and they are making more working hours. But others are with problem with that because some confronting for workers or for the unions. And the third point is the union strategy. This is the more depressive story when we compare with US and Canada. So there is no strategy. Some unions have a good relationship with international unions, but generally speaking, they don't have their capabilities to carry out a national project or even a regional, well, not regional, a national project. As my colleague Graciela Benzunza said, they only attend the contract negotiation and almost always in a very reactive manner without any possibility of revitalization. So it's a just to finish, it's a paradox story because we have a huge unionization rate, 100% in the OEMs and very high in the suppliers. But at the same time, the unions are totally separate, totally fragmented from the regions. We can speak more about that. And in addition, we have 3 different levels of active or true unions, from the active to less active to phantom unions. So we have a very heterogeneous situation, and at the end, most of them are under the umbrella of the CTM. And inside the CTM, you have many type of unions, from highly corrupted ones to more honest and democratic unions, such as the Guanajuato case. So it's complicated, and all of them belongs to the new party. So in my opinion, the competitive advantage of Mexico will remain, and unfortunately, the union situation of Mexico gives another economically competitive advantage for the whole the Mexicans, and that's bring very quite a specific situation in Mexico. Last point, between 2019 to 2025, the increases salaries goes from 5 times in Mexico. Anyway, the gap with US is still very high, 8 times, 8 to 9 times. That's it.
Thanks, Jorge. Charlotte. Oh, no, Ian. Sorry, I missed. We'll finish with Charlotte.
So I don't like giving unsolicited advice to union people, but since you asked, I will. And what I would like to see is international solidarity. The UAW is very good at communications and winning wage increases, but there has to be more than that. So good union jobs, they should also want good union jobs in Ontario, not just Michigan and New York State. And they should want them in Mexico, and not just in Texas. And we have there are instruments for this. My colleagues at the ILR school, Desiree Leclerc and the Worker Institute, they did a study showing how international labor standards can improve things in the Mexican auto industry. For the worst jobs out there, there's a question from Laurel Ritchie, or a point. Tariffs don't address that. What we need to do is organize on a transnational scale.
Thanks for your briefness, Ian. Charlotte.
I will try and be brief. I would say, first of all, I find this a fascinating question because, of course, CAW before UAW Canada, CAW, and now Unifor have been involved in the trade fight since its founding. They were a leader in the fair trade fight during the free trade debate in the 1980s, and now here we are again. So I expect and assume that Canada's in a different position than we were 30 years ago. We're much more integrated with the US and Mexico, but we also need to be, because to be competitive globally, we have to have a powerful enough North American auto industry in order to survive, I think, with competition from various Asian producers as well as the Europeans. So I think in that sense, I expect, and you certainly see it from the president of Unifor, industrial policy, fair trade as being an important position for the union, and one that I think is a national leading position for all of us. I think alliance building. What I think alliance building with not just auto workers, yes, trying to convince the UAW, because Jim and I might disagree on this. I think workers' support for Trump's agenda is actually very, very important to why he's able to weather some of the storms he is. And I think a kind of publicity and alliance building between workers auto workers, steel workers, both in Canada, but also Mexico and the US. I think trying to realize no worker is going to benefit from this tariff regime. There is not a worker in Canada, the US, or Mexico that is ultimately going to benefit from this tariff regime. The people who are benefiting are the companies, but also there are various others who will benefit from this, but it is not the consumers and it is not workers. Finally, I think advocating government policy. We need, and this was implied in Angelo's comments earlier, we need to make sure that governments introduce more extensive income supports for workers as they transition in auto, but also this is where alliances can be built with workers across the economy. Income supports for those impacted by tariffs, whether they're in steel, aluminum, various sectors, and looking at farmer supports as well. I do think that alliances across the country will be critical to the success. So if we talk about canola producers, then let's make sure that farmers are also getting adequate income supports. And of course, industrial transition. Governments need to get serious about what is an industrial policy. This is absolutely critical, not for today, but for the long term. And that speaks, Jim, to one of your comments about that need for thinking about what is that income, what is that economic strategy? Is it import substitution? I don't know, but we certainly need to look at it quickly, and we need to give a plan so that we can start pressuring this new government to introduce those kind of policies that will sustain the Canadian economy. So.
Thanks. Angelo said he's willing to give his intervention for the public. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and I don't know if these people want to speak directly or they want me to ask the question. We had a question from Laurel Ritchie. Jen Armour also asked me a question. Or anyone wants to jump in, you can raise your hand and open your mic. Laurel, Alex.
If you don't mind, I can go.
Yes.
It's very nice to see you guys, everyone. And Charlotte, Jim, everyone, Matthew. Yeah. First, this is a kind of deja vu. We need to remember that 8 years ago, it was happening the same. And we need to remember that this is the fight between the great men in history and history tendencies. So, the great men 8 years ago did the same to a great extent. At the end of the first year, many things settled down. We need to look and see what is new right now. Not in terms of the guy is more aggressive, but in terms of tendencies. And one critical tendency is, of course, China. And another one is that in the North American context, Mexico remains doing this critical role of social dumping. The gap in wages, let me tell you, just a little correction, it's not 8, it's not 9. It grows in the last few years because of the strikes in Canada and US and the huge increase, the record increase in wages that you got. The gap right now is 16 times. You see? So, and the question is, after, in my idea, this is not going to last to the end of this year. All these Trumpomania tendencies of aggressiveness, even right now he's slowing down. You can put it in terms of what is the sustainability of all this stuff. Okay, in my idea, the critical question, I don't remember if Charlotte or Angelo put it, is where we are going to be at the end of all this turmoil. And I guess that in this respect, it's critical to think and discuss in the terms that some of you start to moving on, which is how to build a North American cross-border industry in this industry of industries, right? Because otherwise, after all this, North America, the three of us, countries, labor, we're going to be in more difficult and critical situation because I'm sure, I'm positive this is going to end, but not at the same point because the aggressiveness of the guy is going to put it in a worse situation. Sorry for taking the time. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, Alex. Any other comments or question from the audience? We had a question by Jen Armour, who was asking if it's wise for Canada to rethink their approach to applying reciprocal tariffs on goods from the US. Angelo, maybe you could answer that.
Yeah. Well, okay. Maybe I'll just say two quick things.
Yeah.
One to Alex's intervention. You can read into this as much as you want. For folks who recall, the United States, when the NAFTA was being renegotiated the first time, their starting point position was they wanted to have the rules of origin for vehicles in North America to be set at 85% local content, and they wanted to have a 50% US content minimum within every vehicle. If you watch what's happening right now, that is precisely where this is steering its way toward. So I think Alex is right about, let's not forget where we were 8 years ago. And this is like a second coming of that exact position, just with more aggression. They're going to take what they want one way or the other. What's interesting is that they keep giving deference to this agreement that we all agree is not worth the paper it's written on. But there's constantly CUSMA, USMCA carve-outs to different things. So that also may present a signal. So I thought Alex's points were right. On the points about that Jen raised, yes, I'm very much in the camp. I know there's folks, there's a lot of debate over this, but Canada, I think, has been quite strategic in how it's approached its retaliatory tariffs. They have been very careful to focus on substitutable goods. They have been very careful to focus on finished goods and really stay away from input and intermediate goods in their efforts. That to me is a very strategic approach to how you do this. The part that I can't quite understand, and I'm sure there's a reason for it, but if we don't put tariffs on vehicles, for instance, that are going to be going or coming from the United States, what effectively we are doing is we are paving the path for automakers to calculate that why are we doing this stuff here? Why can't we just get tariff-free access back to Canada and move products to the U.S. where we don't have the tariffs? We need some leverage. We need some counterbalancing. And frankly, when you look at the remission program that's been proposed and now implemented by the Canadian government to basically give additional credit to those who build in Canada, to say they will allow tariff-free access of those vehicles if you build in Canada. That goes to Jim's initial point. Like, that is the closest thing that resembles an auto-pact style remission arrangement that underpinned the whole model. I think the Auto Pact of 1965, I mean, 4 automakers back then who had basically 100% of the sales market. That's not what it is today. So we'd have to really think about what this could look like. But that's kind of the premise of it. So I'm not bothered by that approach at all. And I don't think most Canadians and workers certainly aren't going to be bothered by that approach. I get it's inconvenient, but right now convenience isn't what's driving the policy, right? So that's just our take on it, I would say.
Okay. It's 1:30, but maybe one last intervention from someone, except Alex that already had an intervention. Any more comments? Questions? Okay, so maybe Jim, final comments since you started.
Well, mostly that was just a fascinating discussion. I learned so much from the other speakers. Angelo, you have my full solidarity and support. I can only imagine what the whole team at your union and at the other unions in the other countries are going through. And all of us as researchers and scholars know that we stand with you. If there's anything we can do to help the fight back at this moment, we're here for you.
Okay, so on behalf of CRIMT and all the panelists, I wish you a good day, and I'm really thankful of having this superstar panel, and I guess we'll have more discussion in the future, whether on the auto industry or on industrial strategy. That seems to be a really hot topic right now. So thanks everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.